Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you guys for putting this together, Brandon and Joe especially, and kind of jump off a little bit from where Jeff's presentation ended. You probably got a pretty good flavor of the history of the Jewish people, the beginning of the state of Israel a long, long time ago, and the 4,000-year history in about 12 minutes, which also, obviously, I hope you got at least a little bit of a sense. The connection to Jewish people and a lot of non-Jewish Zionists is a term. So if you're a supporter of Israel, it matters not what faith you are, or if you're of any faith, you're a Zionist. So that gives you a pretty good sense of that. What I wanted to talk about is a little bit more present day. The issues you probably read and hear about a lot in the newspaper, Jeff alluded to them, touched upon them, specifically to the Palestinian dispute in Iran. And also kind of tie that into where Jeff ended his presentation, where Brandon has been involved as well, and that is pro-Israel activism, what you can do. There's, first of all, Iran, and I think that's the most timely, and it certainly isn't just a Zionist or pro-Israel or Jewish concern at all, because the issue in Iran is you have a dictator there who said a lot of terrible things about wanting to destroy the Jewish state, and beyond just mere rhetoric, he actually has the ability to do so with a growing nuclear weapons program that is funded by petroleum. Petroleum is a very profitable commodity to have. If you have petroleum, you have money. If you have money and bad intention, you can do a lot of very bad things with it. And that really is a concern of many people. Certainly those of us in the pro-Israel community have a concern, but all Americans have a concern. Just recently, as recently as today, as a matter of fact, both in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, I think, was last week by a vote of, I believe it was 414 to 6. And as any of you who follow politics knows, there's nothing in Washington people agree to 414 to 6. There's far too much partisan infighting. That's another conversation we can have if you invite me back. But 414 to 6, the House of Representatives voted on a bill called Iran Sanctions Enabling Legislation. And what that bill does is it provides the states more opportunity to do something called divestment. And what divestment is, this ties into what you can do as a pro-Israel activist. Divestment is, getting back to Iran for a minute, just to back up a step. Iran sells petroleum, that's where they make their money to fund their nuclear weapons program. But they can't just sell petroleum in a nutshell, because they have to pull it out of the oil, out of the ground, they have to pull the petroleum out, they have to essentially make it a commodity and package it, and the extraction technology and everything else costs a lot of money. It not only costs money to do this, but you need the technology to do that. So there's foreign investment in Iran, a lot of it. And but for that foreign investment, Iran is just sitting on a bunch of black gold and they can't do anything with it. So what divestment is aimed to do is to say to investors around the world, do not invest in those energy companies that are investing in Iran. If you send a strong enough signal to those energy companies which are investing in Iran, that we're going to pull our money out of you if you continue to do that, in fact, over time, it doesn't happen overnight, money speaks, they won't invest in Iran. And this has really taken two forms. The form I've been involved in, just from an activist point of view, is at the state level. Last June, I believe it was, in 2008, in the state of Michigan, Governor Granholm signed into law, I think it was the 15th state, 14th or 15th state in the nation to do so, Iranian divestment legislation. We're now, in this state, in the process of that. And that means that the state's public pension funds that are comprised of your dollars as taxpayers are no longer being invested in companies that then take that money and invest in Iran. So if you think of a circle, you think, okay, I watch this stuff in the news, Iran growing the nuclear weapons program is a very bad thing, but I'm sitting here in Detroit or Dearborn or Southfield or Troy, wherever you may be. What can I do about that? Well, one thing you can do that ties in with the activism, the APAC conference that you've been to, is you can actually go to your state representatives, it's already been done in Michigan, and ask them to sponsor legislation to divest, because your taxpayer dollars, when you pay your annual taxes or when you buy gasoline or anything else, that money is going directly to Iran. And if we can pull that money out of Iran, they don't have a funding mechanism for their nuclear weapons program. So far, the Iranian divestment movement, I think it's 18 or 19 states right now, have either completed or are in some form of completion of divestment. It's a very good thing. There are some activists around the country that are now taking in different directions. There are two gentlemen, and their names escape me. I believe they were from a mostly black college in Atlanta. They spoke at policy conference, and they were probably among the best speakers. No insult to anyone else who spoke. But they started on their campus ensuring that their university divested of their own investment holdings in these companies And this was in May or June. When they spoke at the policy conference, they were then expanding that to historically black colleges around the nation, and then from there they wanted to take it to all universities. In Oakland County, Michigan, right up the street where I live, we're talking with county government there to divest. So, and there's individuals in this community too who have done so with their own personal investments, and if they own a company, from their employee investments. The opportunity to do this is great. I mean, there are billions and billions of dollars, and in a relatively short period of time, we can pull out of the Iranian economy. Now, why is that important? Why does that cross the Republican Democratic Party lines? You know, in American politics right now, we're always at each other's throats. It's Republican versus Democrat. Nobody wants to work together. And again, that's a topic for another evening. But this is an issue as demonstrated by the 414-6 vote. This is an issue where there is no daylight between Republicans and Democrats. There is complete agreement on that, on Iranian divestment. It's also an issue that is uniquely well positioned for activists. For example, in Michigan, we approached state legislators, state house members. They had no prior legislative experience in foreign policy issues. They didn't necessarily have initially a lot of knowledge about it. But once they learned that their constituents' tax dollars were actually going to Iran, they were on it immediately. And it passed the State House and the State Senate, I believe, either unanimously or, actually, the State House, I think one guy voted against it. But then when I explained it to him, he said, oh, shoot, I should have voted for it. So you really do have bipartisan cooperation in this. And you see that in Washington from the administration on down. If this legislation makes it through the House and Senate, it's expected to, hopefully in the not so distant future, maybe by the end of the year, maybe before, President Obama is expected to sign it. So that's a very, very important thing that everybody can do and everybody can get involved in. That's not the only thing that we can do regarding Iran, but it's a very, very important part of it. And since everybody in this room is an activist, and to one definition or another, I wanted to bring that up. And from the email I received too, I just wanted to touch on briefly the Palestinian divide. My understanding is from your prior session early in the summer, that was an issue that got a lot of conversation going. And at the end of the day, and this is a very brief summary of a very long and interesting, complex issue, but I think any objective observer has to give a lot of credit to both President Clinton and President Bush for trying to do everything that they knew how to do in very, very different ways to try to resolve this problem. President Clinton, again, this is an oversimplification to be sure, but he took a very hands-on, proactive approach. He invited Yasser Arafat now deceased to the White House a number of times, very proactively engaged. He worked very hard using his office as president and his political capital to come to an agreement. And if you read his memoirs, my interpretation of his memoirs is that he was profoundly disappointed by Arafat's essentially 11th hour walking away from that agreement when it offered so much opportunity to not only the Israelis but the Palestinian people. I think when Bush came into office, he looked at that and said, okay, we've had 8 years of active engagement, and it resulted in a situation that was probably arguably worse than when Clinton came into office. So let's just put down some parameters, let's put down a goalpost, if you will, and not worry about day-to-day diplomacy as much and see where it goes. At the conclusion of Bush's term, the situation again was probably as bad, if not worse, than the first day of his presidency. And I would say that I personally, regardless of one's political preferences, I wouldn't blame either person. I think they both deserve a lot of credit. I think the reality is that unless and until you have a partner on the Palestinian side who is more committed to a peaceful resolution than to the continued turmoil, there's nothing the United States president can do. I mean, President Barack Obama inherited a few problems when he took office. Bad economy, something called Iraq, something called Iran. Afghanistan, what am I forgetting? Healthcare, yeah, let's not forget healthcare. So he's got a lot on his plate. And to think that especially facing all of those challenges, despite the fact that he won in a landslide and he had a very strong political mandate from the people of America, that he is going to be able in a short period of time to do any better than Clinton or Bush is not a realistic expectation for him. Because I think, as you point out in your presentation, if you look at the Egyptian example and the Jordanian example, America played a leadership role and a helpful role. But ultimately it took the leaders of those two nations, Israel and Egypt in one example, and Israel and Jordan in the other, to come down and do that, and to make a deal. So I guess I don't say this with despair, nor do I say it with optimism. But I think that if it comes down to the Palestinian issue, which is not the #1 issue on the president's foreign policy agenda at the moment, which I think is understandable, I don't think that there's a lot that he can do unless and until there is a time when you have, on the Palestinian side, as well as the Israeli side, obviously, a willing partner for peace. And we haven't seen that. We've gotten close, and every now and then it seems like we get a little bit closer, but just before he tries to shoot that ball over the goal line, it doesn't quite happen. So I think that just by way of managing expectations a little bit, I don't think that's a completely fair expectation to place on the administration of Congress. And that's all I wanted to kind of limit my comments to that, and look forward to some conversation and some questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Bryce. And